It's been 3 years since the Taliban took over. The Afghan Republic has become the Islamic Emirate, and its emir is the head of the state.
Since the Taliban took control of Afghanistan, women's faces have all but disappeared, either covered over or covered up.
After the main bulk of the forces left in 2014, and we already saw poverty levels rising then, went off a cliff when the Taliban decided to take Kabul by military force.
Hi, you've tuned into The State of Southasia, a podcast from Himal, Southasian, where we have the best minds on the region to unpack crucial issues affecting our politics, cultures, environments, and societies. I'm your host, Nayanthara Narayanan, coming to you from Bangalore, a city that's rather quiet right now because many people have left for the long weekend. The extra holiday was to mark India's Independence Day, which is on August 15th. And of course, Pakistan also celebrated a day earlier on August 14th. But there was another milestone in Southasia this week, and that was 3 years of the Taliban taking over the reins in Afghanistan. My guest today is Kate Clark, co-director of the Afghanistan Analysts Network, who splits her time between Kabul and London. Kate, thank you for coming on this podcast and for doing this on a Sunday.
And I should also add, Afghanistan had its Independence Day as well.
That's right.
It wasn't direct British rule like the subcontinent suffered, but it was the British controlling foreign policy, and the Afghans consider that they are also independent from Britain from the 1920s. So.
Absolutely. And we're recording this on the 18th of August, just 3 days after the Taliban celebrated 3 years of taking over in Kabul and the complete withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan and the fall of the government of the Republic of Afghanistan. That was in August 2021. Kate, you're in London right now, but I'm sure you watched the celebrations, the military parade in Bagram Air Force Base, and all the speeches that were made back in Kabul. What did you make of it?
So I was in Afghanistan for the independence celebrations under the first Taliban Emirate. So that would be 2000. And there you saw just thousands of men lounging in the back of pickups, wearing flip-flops with their Kalashnikovs. There were a few Soviet-era tanks, a few big weapons, but not much. It was really, really low tech. And this is how the Taliban captured Afghanistan the first time round. This time, they've got all the US kit that was left behind. So up to and including helicopters. It was much, much showier, a bigger military. Obviously, it's not fighting anymore. In 2000, it was still fighting the Northern Alliance. This time, it's showing off. It was a military parade to show off Emirate strength, and also sort of thumbing the nose at the Americans that they've got all this kit now.
Right. So here's a quick recap on what life in Afghanistan has been like over the past 3 years. So in August 2021, the Taliban declared Afghanistan an Islamic Emirate and implemented their interpretation of the Sharia law. This, of course, immediately meant restrictions on women, whose movement, attire, access to education, and opportunities to work have been severely restricted. But there's also been a terrible and worsening broader humanitarian crisis in the country. About 75% of Afghanistan's economy before August 2021 depended on foreign assistance. But the Taliban government has been isolated by the global order because of its conservative and repressive policies. And so most of that funding just suddenly stopped because of international sanctions that were led by the United States. So this has led to a banking crisis, plummeting of household incomes, and acute malnutrition across the country. It has left Afghanistan very poorly equipped to deal with natural disasters. And the floods and the earthquakes that have happened have really turned into catastrophes in this period. Meanwhile, there has been an expansion, a kind of proliferation of terror groups on Afghan territory, and increasing attacks within the country and in neighboring countries like Pakistan, which in turn have triggered, refugee crises. So, Kate, I'd like to start with the economic situation. So the World Bank estimates that Afghanistan's real GDP growth dropped by a whopping 26% over the last 2 years and is expected to stagnate till the end of 2025. What does this really look like on the ground?
Well, you've got a lot of people who are unemployed, lots of people lost their jobs. after the crash in August 2021. Things stabilized. So basically, Afghanistan was a very strange economy between 2001 and 2021. It had amounts of foreign money coming in that were unearned that basically has no global equivalent. More than the entire GDP, more than the entire economy was coming in. And that wasn't just aid, that was also military support. And that was also dwarfing both of those was the money that the foreign armies spent in Afghanistan on logistics, on rent, on personnel, wages. So that was already coming down in after the main bulk of the forces left in 2014, and we already saw poverty levels rising then. Went off a cliff when the Taliban decided to take Kabul by military force. And obviously you lost the military support, you lost the money that the foreign armies were spending, but you also lost aid. And that economy had been very strange because when you get a government that's reliant on foreign money rather than taxation, of course, it's the foreigners who call the shots, and there's a disempowerment of citizens. And it also drives corruption. It weakens the domestic production because all that money drives up rent, it drives up wages. Domestic producers can't compete. And all of those things should have been really, really carefully sorted out before the foreign income fell. Ashraf Ghani, who was the last president, was increasing taxation. It was better than under Karzai, but still it was a very, very strange economy. And of course, that also drove corruption. One study, it looked like maybe only a third of customs money was coming into the Central Treasury. So a lot of that was going to officials. A lot of that was going to the insurgency, which is also raking off money. So it was, in some ways, it was also a strange insurgency. The Taliban decided to take Kabul by force. All that money went overnight. And gradually over that winter, there was huge, sudden poverty. The civilian aid came back online in large amounts, but it's mainly humanitarian and it doesn't go through the government. So it's a different sort of, it's not very efficient. It's not a great way to support people, but that was sort of the political solution which the big donors found, that they wanted to help Afghans, they didn't want to help the Emirates. So it's an unhappy impasse that's carried on for the last 3 years. And the other problem, of course, is that the Afghan population's rising. So even if there is growth, it's not growth per capita. So that's the other problem. Then you've got climate change, you've got droughts, natural disasters, problems with actually getting abroad. In the old days, if you were really struggling, you could get to Pakistan and Iran at least. That's not possible. Pakistan's been pushing Afghans back. It's a really tough situation.
Right. You mentioned taxation, and you've just authored a report, Taxing the Afghan Nation, in which you explain how, in addition to, the usual income and business taxes that a government levies, the Taliban, of course, are now levying Islamic taxes as well. How is this impacting people who have houses and who are trying to run businesses?
Yeah. So I think one thing to remember is that the Islamic Republic, which actually also considered itself an Islamic country, and Sharia was also the basis. No law under the Republic could contradict Sharia. So the idea that it went from, somehow a secular country to Taliban's Islamic Emirate is not true. Afghanistan is a deeply religious country. That's the bottom line. But the state did not collect what are called Islamic taxes, which is ushur, which is 10% on the harvest. Zakat is the sort of the bigger category. In Afghanistan, that would be a tax on increases in sheep, flocks and goats, flocks and herds of cows, sort of livestock. Actually, most countries in the world that call themselves Islamic, the state doesn't collect those taxes. It's seen as a personal duty for the individual believer. The Taliban, they were running the insurgency. They collected these taxes, particularly on the poppy harvest, and they've introduced them to the rural areas. They don't go to the Ministry of Finance.
Right.
They're collected by the Ministry of Agriculture and they go directly to the Supreme Leader's office. There is zero transparency. I mean, they say that it goes to orphans and widows, which is how it should happen under Islamic law. We don't know. So that's a huge extra burden on all the rural households that have farming as an income. And we even found some things that are really strange under Sharia, villages that were collectively taxed. I mean, this is an individual's obligation. It's nothing to do with the community. And in general, under the Republic, you could typically often get away with not paying your taxes if you paid bribe. The Taliban have been really good at tax collection. So they were very good at it as an insurgent group. It's one of the first things they did when they started taking districts in 2021 was to start to tax the population. Generally, they've been less corrupt in the collection, but in the what they spend that money on, they've been very opaque.
Right.
And there's not that much. So you've got extra burden on households generally, definitely in the rural areas. And what citizens get for that money, there's been some indications. It looks like the World Bank reckons about half of it is going on wages for police and soldiers. So that's basically the Taliban paying themselves.
Right.
And this is a country where you've got, as you know, the audience out there will know, it's one of the poorest countries in the world in terms of education, health. It needs money for agricultural support, a whole range of social things, infrastructure. But no, the Emirate has decided to spend a good half of the income on, basically it's on its own people. And you can understand why, because they want to keep their people on side. So politically it makes sense, but from an economic, a social point of view, it's really tough, really, really tough.
Right. And which, brings me to the many crises now faced by people in Afghanistan. You have this very impoverished, hungry population. There are very high levels of malnutrition. There are reports that say that people are surviving on just bread and tea. And then there have been these periodic natural disasters like the earthquake in Herat, the floods in north and central Afghanistan. And on top of all this, there's a failing healthcare system as well. What has struck you the most about the conditions under which people are living right now and have been over the past 3 years?
Well, we decided when we were doing research on what life was like in the districts that the Taliban were taking in 2021, and this is built on research that we did about what it was like to live under the Taliban during the insurgency. And one of the things that struck us was the household economy. So A, this moving to tax people immediately, but B, the economic crisis that individuals were facing. So we did a lot of work on that, and it was really difficult to read these stories. People losing their jobs, salaried people losing their jobs, urban poverty where things had been a lot better because of all that foreign money that was sloshing around, suddenly facing absolute penury. In the rural areas, they'd had 2 drought years. The fighting had been intense and really vicious that last year. In Kabul and other cities, we'd seen lots and lots of assassinations, many that the Taliban didn't claim, of journalists, human rights workers, pilots. But in the rural areas, there was a lot of really nasty fighting, and people couldn't get to harvest, people couldn't irrigate. So there was these problems building up. And typically in the rural areas, people do have access to a bit of land. They can grow some crops to feed the family at least. What struck us, though, amongst all this misery was that Afghans, when they have a little bit of good fortune, they share it. So, we had tales of people who, cousin in America would send $50 and they'd give $5 to the widow down the road who had no adult men to support her.
Right.
This was absolutely typical of how people are coping. And I think, the World Bank talks about fragile states. I look at Afghans and I think, good Lord, they cope with everything that the world throws at them. And they do that partly because they've got these very, very strong social networks and relationships, which mean that if you've got good times, you help. And if you're in bad times, you borrow. And you do look after people who may not be even your kith and kin. There's a really strong social organisation. I also, I look at Britain, for example, with our lovely welfare state, which is not so good anymore. But I just think if Britain suffered what Afghans suffered, we would fall apart immediately. Right. So I think that's one of the things amidst the misery that these really sort of, I don't know, it's almost like you're living on bread and tea, but you have a spoonful of sugar occasionally. It's that sort of place.
Right. But specifically, what does access to healthcare look like? How are hospitals, like clinics that might be in rural areas, how are they functioning?
Well, it's never been very good. The health system relied a lot on foreign money. Some of that stayed, some of that went. People who are richer, even a bit richer, would try and send their sick relatives to Pakistan, Iran, India if they could afford it, the Gulf if they could afford it. So there's a lot of exporting of health problems. There's a lot of self-medication. Afghanistan's got a huge problem with drugs, and that's often because of people trying to treat physical pain or mental health, despair, demoralization, actual anxiety, depression. So that would be opioids, including opium and heroin, some of the prescription drugs, Valium, barbiturates. So that's one of the things that people do. There's a lot of drugs that are just counterfeit that don't actually work. So that's a big problem. The hospitals tend to be overcrowded. There's a scarcity of doctors, particularly female medical staff. And of course, that's been made far worse by a couple of things. One, this ban that the Emirate has introduced on girls going to high school and university. So there will be problems. That isn't manifesting itself quite yet, but there will be a shortage of female medical staff. And of course, even the Taliban want a female doctor to treat their sick wives or daughters.
Right.
So there is a demand there that is not going to be met in the future by supply. The other thing, of course, is that if you are a middle-class Afghan with a bit of money and you're worried about your daughters not going to school, you may try and leave. So there has been an exodus of precisely those professional people who Afghanistan needs. And so there's a lot of people left in that huge evacuation of 2021, but it's continuing drip, drip, drip for Afghans who can get, and you need money to get out. But if you're determined and you are worried about your girls' education, people will try and find a way.
Right. So, of course, since August 2021, I think the conversation that's been had most often and the biggest concern, and rightly so, has been around women. Because the Taliban is known to have these very repressive policies and outlook on women. So you mentioned the restriction on education. In fact, the Taliban had promised to keep girls in school, but months after they took over, there was a ban on any girl studying beyond 6th grade. There has been restrictions on women working. There's stories of beauty parlors being shut down across the country because they offer un-Islamic services. And I say un-Islamic in quotes, of course. Dress codes have been very strictly implemented, and people have in fact been detained for not adhering to these dress codes. Very recently, women government employees have had their salaries slashed very drastically. Again, Kate, I'm going to ask you, what does this look like on the ground? What are women saying about what's happening to them?
It's really, 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 really hard because it's not like women and girls have never had these freedoms and these rights. They've been taken away. So it's been a really painful and frustrating time. One of the problems was that the Taliban didn't introduce these restrictions immediately. So, for example, they came in, they took Kabul, and there was talk of men and women working shoulder to shoulder to build the new Afghanistan. There were lots of good words. And I think if they had introduced them all straight away, there would have been a lot more protest. But they've come in gradually, drip, drip, drip. And it's meant that apart from a few really, really brave women's rights activists, there's been very little public protest, but a lot of unhappiness and a lot of uneasiness. And a lot of that actually is within the Taliban ranks. Afghanistan has seen a sea change in attitudes to education. And that was particularly with the Afghans who went to Pakistan, particularly Iran, in the 90s when the Soviet Union invaded and there was the widespread bombing of the countryside. So you had people who they'd never had schools in their districts. They go to Iran, Pakistan, they see that the sky doesn't fall in when their kids go to school, including their girls. And the same thing has happened with the Taliban in exile during the 2000s, particularly those in the big Pakistani cities or in the Gulf. And they think, well, the neighbours' kids are going to school. My daughter comes in and says, Daddy, can I go to school? And you think, well, why not? This is an Islamic society. Why not? And you had senior Taliban in the Gulf with girls going to university.
Yeah.
Including also Karachi and Quetta. So you often find with the Taliban that it's, there has been a sea change amongst them as well as the wider Afghan population. The ban on girls' education is not popular. And I'd say for me, one of the problems is that these sort of issues should be decided at the family level or the community level. It's not up to the state what a family does inside the home. And that sort of extends to education as well. So under the Republic, if your dad was very conservative, you probably didn't get to school. But you could point to your neighbours and say, Dad, can I go? Fatima next door is going, why can't I? There was a space for negotiation. Now, if you've got a really liberal family and your parents want you to go to university or schools, the ceiling's been reduced. There isn't that room for manoeuvre. You can't, it doesn't really matter what your family thinks. There aren't the schools to go to. There's some underground education in some areas. There may be schools open because you've got Taliban officials that turn a blind eye. That happened in the first emirate as well, much more widely than I think was accepted. I was in Kabul for the BBC in the last years of the Taliban, there were whole schools open for primary school education, which was officially banned. Local authorities turned a blind eye, but of course you didn't have, camera phones. You didn't have social media. It was much easier to hide what you were doing from the authorities. And there was a lot, there were places where things were much, much more liberal than the officials. You get some of that now, but less. It's more difficult now. And the problem is you've got the Emir is very hardline. He comes from an area of Afghanistan where women don't go out once they reach puberty. You don't see the faces of women that you're not closely related to. So I think for those Taliban, having girls on the streets is just anathema. Girls who should be married and home and having babies, in their view, are out on the streets without mahrams, without male chaperones. I mean, they believe it leads to fitna, to social disorder and to sin.
Right.
And you or I might think, well, it's up to men to behave themselves and restrict their own desires. But for these people, it is incumbent on the state to restrict women and girls so that there is no sin.
Right, which is also why women have now been restricted from parks and gyms.
Yes.
And so I guess, in context of what you're saying, even though there is widespread unhappiness about this ban on education, it's too much to hope that there will be some kind of pushback, that this might be reversed, because, as you said, the Emir is very hardline.
Well, I think one of the problems was, if you think about August 2021, a lot of the activists left. So you had a real disjuncture with society. People who might have been pushing, political leaders, human rights advocates, a lot of them left. And it was a real trauma, and you had the Taliban coming in and they were absolutely in control. If I think about earlier times in Afghanistan where you've had that change of regime, there's typically been a part of Afghanistan that was not controlled by Kabul. So in the 90s, the north was controlled, much more liberal, and actually the area is controlled by General Dostum, who's for all his sins, he's more of a secular leader in Mazar. Or you had sort of refuge, the Afghan leaders would not leave the region. They would go to Iran or Pakistan. There would be continuing interaction with what was going on in Afghanistan. And people would be thinking about, how can I get home?
Right.
What can I do? And the mass evacuation sort of established that as, if you're unhappy, then you leave, rather than continue to fight for what you think is right. And I'm not an advocate of the armed struggle at all. I think Afghanistan's been, as many countries, has suffered from war and people taking up a Kalashnikov to think about their rights. But there also hasn't been the social mobilization that you might have had if there was a different way that the regime changed. So I think that's one of the problems. Secondly, people are really demoralized. They're economically hard up. I mean, I don't think it's not correct to say that they are passive, but they're doing things very quietly and under the radar.
Right.
So you will get the elders discussing things with local Taliban officials, making efforts to change things at the local level, trying to make things as good as possible. And that might be to do with girls' education, or it might be to do with ensuring madrasas stay independent, so that you don't get madrasas that are linked to the big political figures in the government. That's really important for some communities. They want to keep their independence. Might be to do with taxation. We don't think this is correct, what you're doing. We've had a really hard year. We don't think people should be paying ushur. But that's also problematic when you've got a government that is mainly drawn from one ethnic community. So they're all men. They're mainly entirely mullahs, almost entirely mullahs. They're almost entirely Pashtun. So obviously, if you're not in that group, it's much in a connected society like Afghanistan, where Wasita connections is hugely important for getting things done. If you don't have people in the government that look like you, and it's uncle or it's second cousin, or at least your dad went to school with that person, it's much, much, much more difficult to try and keep your independence, or to try and argue for how you think your local area should be run. I mean, the other thing to say is that Afghans, I would say, traditionally have seen the state as the enemy.
Right. Yeah.
Going back centuries. I think it's a bit different now, because the state has been providing services over the last 20 years. It's a bit different, but generally there's quite a strong desire to try and take what you can from the state, but try and restrict its influence in your life.
And also with the Taliban government, this gets quite dangerous, because, the policies of public floggings and amputations and mass executions have been reintroduced. But how much of that is actually happening on the ground? There definitely have been some reports, especially of floggings. What's happening on the ground?
It's minimal. I mean, minimal as in the Emir ordered the judges to deliver more of these punishments, particularly when they are seen as mandatory under Sharia.
Right.
So there was an uptick after that. And they have they have a deterrent effect, I'm sure. I'd say the other thing is, with justice systems, the harshness of the punishment is only one issue. It's also about how likely perpetrators are to be caught and perpetrated, and the correct perpetrators, how fair the justice system is. And I think that's all still under the Republic. It was horrible. People, the judges were some of the one of the state institutions that were most held to be most corrupt. And under the Taliban, the justice is much swifter. It's difficult as well now because it's a very male system. So if you're female, it's much, much more difficult. You don't have the female judges. You don't have the female lawyers in court or out of court. And as a woman going into all male environments, it's really, really difficult. And particularly as, women tend to be more illiterate, rates of illiteracy are higher. You may not know what the law says about your rights. The Emir has been really pushing some women's rights mandated by Islamic laws, so particularly in inheritance, the right to refuse marriage. So in Afghanistan, where revenge is part of the code, which you can see is a way of trying to keep murders down. If you fear that you will start a revenge cycle, you're less likely to indulge in violence. That would be the thinking behind that sort of system. But one of the really cruel aspects of that is if you can't pay money and you want to resolve a dispute, the family of the murdered person can demand a girl married from your family. And those girls are treated, you can imagine, you're the sister of the murderer of the family's son, for example. And you're typically a child bride. It's a really, really cruel practice. It was outlawed by the Taliban the first time around by Mullah Omar. After he heard BBC soap opera feature this particular storyline, he allegedly heard it and banned it, and it's been rebanned. So that's good. Curiously, systems that are all out on Islamic law and women's dress and whatever, they typically forget about the rights that women have to inherit, which are very meticulously documented. It's not as much as men get, but it's a right. And we have heard some courts absolutely insisting on that, but sort of sexist culture against Islamic law, where it does give women some rights. It's typically where men are in charge, they tend to adopt the rules that suit them and just turn a blind eye to the ones that don't. That seems to be a global phenomenon in my experience.
Yes, very selective interpretations.
Exactly.
Kate, you talked about how a lot of aid workers had left, but also there has been a clampdown on civil society organizations and journalists trying to work inside the country. Tell us a little more about that.
Well, I guess the good thing is that there was quite a healthy journalistic sector under the Republic. It wasn't perfect, and journalists often complained about people on the government side threatening them more actually than the insurgents. So that was to bear in mind. I would say that the journalism wasn't neutral in the way that many of the organizations treated the insurgency as the enemy. It was a sort of, they would see it as patriotic journalism. There are a few journalists who felt that was really wrong. Journalists particularly who'd worked under earlier phases of the Civil War, who thought that as journalists you should be neutral, even if you were largely based in government areas. And that, I would say, I've been really impressed with Afghan journalists. They have really struggled against the state. The Emirate definitely sees journalism. They talk about it as a part of the jihad to bolster the Emirate and to bolster the Afghan nation, and that criticism shouldn't be done openly. For example, some of the news networks, they've managed to keep women on air. They're wearing a niqab now and fully veiled, but they're on air. There are still female reporters. Some families, there's been some families don't want their girls to work or their women to work because they see it as dangerous. But it's not a police state with a completely captive media landscape. I take my hat off to the brave Afghan journalists on the ground who've managed to do that. It's still very much, you tread carefully and you're not quite sure where the red lines are, and you might be arrested and detained and beaten. And then you've got the news organizations outside. Some of them are good. They've kept their journalist principles. Others are just propaganda, anti-Taliban propaganda. And, these are journalists who should know better. They seek out ways to denigrate the Emirate, to cut down the Emirate. And I also think that's as propagandist as the state-run newspapers and networks. So it's a mixed picture. The region struggles with independent journalism generally. It's not just Afghanistan, it's not just the Emirate. Journalists have to be brave.
Yeah. So here's a
or
quick
if they are.
reminder to everyone listening that in a previous episode of State of Southasia, I spoke to senior journalist Lakshmi Murthy on the crisis of journalism across South Asia. So do go back and listen to that if you haven't already. And it takes a lot to bring you in-depth, independent coverage of the whole of South Asia. And at Himal, we rely on listeners like you. So support our work, which will help us bring you more stories, produce more podcasts like this one. So you can become a patron of the magazine by clicking on the link in the episode notes or by going to our website and clicking support Himal. You can also sign up to our newsletters to keep up with our latest stories, events, and more. You'll see a sign up link to our newsletters also in the episode notes. Now we get back to our conversation with Kate Clark. Kate, the security situation in Afghanistan, there are many people who have told reporters covering the region that they are glad for the stability, which is basically the end of the fighting that came in after August 2021. But there have also been reports of a proliferation of terror groups who are kind of operating, without fear of too much oversight because the Taliban government is restricted. What have you been seeing over these past 3 years?
Okay, so I guess the first thing to say is Afghanistan is much less violent in terms of, obviously you've got sort of indirect violence if the state is, for example, forcing women not to go to public parks. I do think you have to acknowledge that there is that sort of inherent violence within the system. But in terms of guns, bombs, rockets, it's a different place than under the Republic. And that's partly, of course, because one side won and the US forces left, the Afghan forces became Taliban. And the other party to the conflict under the Republic was the Islamic State of Khorasan province, which is like the local franchise in particularly Afghanistan and Pakistan relating to the Islamic State group. They have continued. It was interesting, under the Republic, there was quite a bit of, I can't say coordination, but between the Emirate forces and the US military and the Afghan forces and local groups, there was some sort of cooperation to get the ISKP out of the stronghold that they did have in eastern Afghanistan. Now it is the Taliban just trying to extinguish ISKP. And some of that you can say is justified. It's a group that is way out of even the most radical Afghan views of what an Islamic society should look like. So they were even closing down clinics, for goodness sake, under areas under their control. But there are also people who have a peaceful version of the violent bit of Islam that the ISKP follow, which are the Salafists. And the Taliban have cracked down on them. And the Taliban, like most Sunni Afghans, are from the Hanafi school of Islam. These are people from the Salafist school. So the same bit of Islam that's practiced in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So there's been the UN has documented attacks and detentions and bad treatment of Salafists who have nothing to do with ISKP. So I think that's one thing to mention. In Afghanistan, of course, if you start oppressing a community, there may be a backlash because we've had 40 years of war, and reaching for a Kalashnikov is not. It is an option within the minds of Afghans. Right. So that's one thing. The other thing is the sort of the remnants of the Republic, and particularly those around the old Shirai Nazar, Northern Alliance, the Panshiris and the Northeast. They are continuing to carry out attacks. So that would be people around Amrullah Saleh, the old, God, what did he finish as? He came from an intelligence background. I think he's ended up as interior. Anyway, he's had jobs throughout the Republic. And some of the other, and then there's another group that's less sort of part of the old Jamiat networks, which draws together people from the old Afghan security forces. They're marginal. ISKP is marginal. So the sort of the internal armed opposition is marginal. The Taliban control the country. Then, as you say, you've got the foreign jihadi groups. And I would say, I don't think they are, I'm not sure if they are proliferating or if the Taliban give them free rein. The exception, of course, is the TTP, what are known as the Pakistani Taliban and Islamabad. So I shouldn't laugh. But Islamabad really were hoping that when their boys, as Benazir Bhutto called the Taliban in the 90s, got Kabul, they would have strategic depth against India and, things would be really great. Fortunately, Afghans, a bit like, the Karzai was never the puppet of the Americans. He was always very ungrateful and very, very unhelpful to Washington. Similarly, the Taliban have not been particularly helpful to Islamabad or the ISI. Right. They have, Islamabad is always complaining about the Taliban giving safe haven to TTP, and they've managed to bounce back off the back of that. So that is a particular problem. I'd say as well, sort of in a bigger geopolitical way of looking at the region and Afghanistan. It is a concern not only for Pakistan, who have supported Afghanistan, but also China.
Mm-hmm.
They're worried about Uyghur radicals basing themselves in Afghanistan. That's one of the reasons, I think, why they've been so keen to have good relations with the Taliban. It's a concern for Central Asia, it's a concern for Iran. And it's also a concern for the CIA and for the US. Not necessarily all these groups, but Al-Qaeda and ISKP. And Al-Qaeda, remember, Zawahiri, Ayman Zawahiri, who was the leader of Afghanistan, was killed by a US drone targeting a house in the middle of Kabul. And the Taliban didn't say much publicly. They said it wasn't him, but sort of privately they said, look, we were controlling Al-Qaeda. Fine, they were in the country, but, you know, they weren't causing a threat. And the Americans have been very adamant, look, you signed that accord that meant that we left, which what's called the Doha Agreement, that meant that foreign groups didn't have free reign in Afghanistan. That was pretty well the only condition that the Americans put on the table for it was basically an unconditional withdrawal that Trump and his envoys Al-Michael Azad signed with the Taliban. So they have, you know, they say, well, you know, you haven't adhered to your side of the bargain, and the Taliban say, yeah, but you still got us under sanctions. That's not right either. So there's some tension there, but there's also some on ISKP. The Taliban and the Americans have common cause, and there are rumors, as always, that they are discussed. They talk about that. It's the sort of thing you can't stand up, and it could well be untrue, but at least that is also talked about.
The security concerns also translate into policies that really affect people. And one of the biggest crises we've seen is Pakistan deporting Afghans, many of them who've lived for decades in Pakistan, back across the border into Afghanistan. And I think the latest numbers are something like more than 600,000 refugees have been pushed back into Afghanistan. What are that is a huge crisis, but what other kind of impacts do you see in the South Asian region with these security concerns in Afghanistan?
Well, I think many Afghans would like to leave. At the moment, it's really difficult. Getting to Pakistan is much more difficult than it used to be. Viewers will know about this whole issue of Pashtuns and whether the border was wrongly drawn 130 years ago, was it? Probably about then.
Right.
British and the then Emir, so the British in Imperial India and Emir, and whether that was correct and whether it should have gone through the Pashtun tribes on the border. And in the old days, Afghans could get to Pakistan without ID cards. I mean, there was sort of easy travel, particularly for Pashtuns and particularly those on the border. There's no offence there. Pakistan has built a fence. And if people are interested, we did a really interesting look at what that's meant for communities that have basically been split. So, you know, I might have a sister who's across the other side, who's married to someone from the other side. Or I always sent my ill patients to Peshawar for treatment, or I have a cross-border trade business. So that's much more difficult. Getting to Iran is more difficult. There's lots of, you know, people get sent back. And beyond that, it's difficult. People trying to get to Europe, to Turkey for work. At every stage, it's more difficult. And I think, you know, in earliest phases of the war, you had mass population movements, millions of Afghans leaving. But also, if you look at sort of earlier times, you know, if I look at my own history in Britain, the export of migrants to the world from Europe, not only Britain, but North America, Australia, New Zealand, Africa, South Africa, Zimbabwe, you know, that those sort of safety valves of a growing population to migrate, that's just not there anymore. You do have mass migration with people trying to get to Europe, but not on the same scale. And for Afghans, it's really difficult to get across. Right. So that's a problem for a country where you don't have many options. And I'd just say that the remittances are hugely important. They keep the Afghan economy going, along with the aid money. Remittances are huge, probably even more important. And for the region, you know, there's concern about these particular groups that have violent jihadist ideologies based in Afghanistan, the migrants. On the plus side, you've got economic links. So, for example, China is trying to get signing mineral deals. For those countries that would like a normal relationship with Afghanistan, they tend to be regional, and they tend to talk about trade rather than rights. So that's the other context for regional relations.
Right. And of course, Afghanistan is not the only country with like a refugee problem, you know, with what's going on in Myanmar. There are people fleeing to Thailand and India, and you know, you can read all about that in another story on our website, himalmag.com. But you know, still talking about Afghanistan, there have slowly been arguments for the world not to isolate Afghanistan and the Taliban anymore, but to actually engage with them. There was a recent written anonymously by a female aid worker who's still in Afghanistan about how the funding cuts affect people on the ground the worst, and especially women that she works with. One of our own contributors, Salman Rafi Sheikh, has a piece in Himal talking again about how it's probably a better alternative to engage with the Taliban to keep the other terror groups in check, because they're increasingly might be posing a threat not only to Afghanistan, but South Asia and then eventually the world. What do you make of that? Is it time to maybe offer some kind of conditional assistance to Afghanistan through the Taliban regime?
So at the moment, that's been a political problem. We don't see it. I don't think it'll change. So basically, you've got countries that would like to engage. They're not the donors. The big donors: EU, US, UK, Japan. All of them, Japan and Norway, are the most keen to engage. France and Germany, the least keen. And they would say it's not engage, but everyone's happy to engage. It's going beyond that. It's giving money directly to the government, so on budget aid, and it would be recognition. UK and the US are probably in the middle in terms of the donors. So what has happened since 2021? You've got this humanitarian aid that doesn't go through the government. Sanctions are many, many waivers. Most things are now legal, but the banks don't want to deal with the Afghan banks. So it's really difficult to do trade, to get money home. Organizations, NGOs, it's very difficult to get money to the country. Horrible. So all of that is sort of stifled. So the Taliban blames sanctions, but it's really the banking sector that's the problem there. To change that, there has been, from my point of view, I think if you want to do development aid, or if you want to do climate change, is another example where Afghanistan's in, one of the countries in the world that's most affected by climate change and has done the least to deserve that in terms of global greenhouse emissions. That would be another area where you say Afghanistan deserves help, regardless of who's in charge. I think all of that is on the table, but you cannot expect any of that to change the Emirates' policies. And I think that's been the problem. With the donors, they've sort of said, if you just let girls back to school, we'll give you development aid. Taliban think they're there by God's grace.
Right.
This is a divinely sanctioned victory. They are there as, yes, by God's grace. Why should they deal with anyone else, particularly on internal things and domestic issues, and particularly on women, which is a really sensitive issue involving honor in Afghan culture? You cannot, after 3 years, it is quite clear that the Taliban will not change their policies in return for goodies. So I think deciding to do more development aid, deciding to do more aid for mitigate climate change can all be argued as long as people don't expect any change in the emirate. They don't hope for anything in the emirate, and they don't plan on that. And we then come on to the issue of fungibility of money. So at the moment, there's been, as I said, half of the money that the Taliban get from Afghan citizens goes on paying their own people in the army, the intelligence, and the police service. A lot of the social services are still paid for by donors. So that is, the more you help a country that is ruled by a government like Afghanistan, you do always indirectly support the government, even if you're not putting money through the state apparatus, because it allows them to do other things with the money that they might have spent on healthcare or education. So there is that argument as well against greater support, monetary and development aid going to Afghanistan.
So really no easy answer, no easy solution or clear solution over here.
It's a political impasse. And, I think both sides are as obstinate as the other. The US is not going to give lots of money to Afghanistan to help the Taliban as they see it with development aid while the Taliban are in their current shape. If there was a more inclusive government, if they dropped some of the restrictions on women, I think it would be a different scenario. Taliban aren't going to budge either. And also they feel they shouldn't. It's their right. They're the sovereign power in Afghanistan. They should be helped. They don't like the aid.
Yeah.
But they think they deserve it. So it's a tricky combination. And can I also say, when I was talking about British and other Europeans going and colonizing the world, I didn't recommend this as a good thing.
Right.
Genocide, colonialism, severe exploitation. I just meant that countries at a similar stage of development in Europe had somewhere for their excess population to go to. A country like Afghanistan doesn't at the moment, and that's part of the problem.
Of course.
I just wanted to clear that in case anyone thought that I was pro 19th century European expansion.
No, thank you. That always helps to clear these things up. But Kate, I'm going to wrap this up by asking you for 3 recommendations. What people can read or watch or listen to if they just want to know more about Afghanistan, whether it's present day Afghanistan or histories or cultures. What would you recommend?
Well, apart from Himal, and thank you very much for inviting me on. I'm a big fan. Our organization, the Afghanistan Analyst Network, maybe I'd just tell people a bit about it. But we were set up in 2009, so that was the height of the foreign presence in Afghanistan. It was just as Obama was increasing the surge, which was military and civilian. And you had huge numbers of foreigners with enormous amounts of money, amounts of power, and very little knowledge about Afghanistan. So that's why the organization was set up, mainly as a place to inform foreigners working in Afghanistan. And it's become more Afghan over the years in terms of who writes and who reads. And it turns out that a country that's been at war, where people have been refugees, been internally exiled, they tend to know about what happened to their own people, but often not what happened elsewhere.
Right.
So that was why we were set up. And we do a huge range. Our aim is to be readable. We're not academic, but we have that depth and that nuance. So culture, economy, environment, politics, war, regional relations, international engagement, migration. Those are our big topics. We'd welcome you to read our site. Beyond that, there's I don't know where to start. There are some good books. There are some appalling books written about Afghanistan. There are journalists to follow on Twitter. There are journalists that you really don't want to follow on Twitter. And I don't really want to trash people. The things that I've really, really appreciated. There's a great book by Anand Gopal, who's a journalist who worked in Afghanistan, who came with, I imagine he came with Hindi, so had a sort of regional language and managed to learn Pashto and to travel quite well. I really, really liked his book about the Republic. There's some new books coming along that I'd like to read, but I can't recommend them yet. But there's quite a lot of books just recently published. And then there's books that I really, really appreciated when I was over the years. There's one by someone called Victoria Doubleday, who was in Afghanistan in the 70s, so before the war. And she was a musicologist, so an anthropologist. Her husband, John Bailey, has become they've both been brilliant supporters of Afghan musicians over the years. So John, they were both doing research. They were students. John, as a man, could do that. Victoria realized that as a woman, she had to sort of go into sort of purdah to do that in Herat.
Right.
And it's a beautifully written book about the women of the women musicians of Herat from the inside, but delicately told. You never feel that she's revealing secrets that she shouldn't be revealing. She's had an insider look and is revealing things that would be shameful. It's a really beautiful book. And even though it's 40, 50 years old, I think it's still strangely, it's quite relevant. Another book that was being reviewed this week that I'd like to read about women writers, again, Afghans. And maybe I can send that to you.
That would be lovely.
I should also mention scholars or students. We've got a bibliography on our website of Afghan books, articles, reports that was started that's written by someone called Christian Blauer. And he was an undergraduate who couldn't find a bibliography. So he decided to start his own in 2004. It was originally free, and we now support him to update that. So we published that earlier this year. And most of the things on there are things that he's recommended or he thinks are useful. He also wrote a piece for us about why a lot of the material that's reproduced now is so bad. It's second-rate, second sourcing, people who don't know about Afghanistan writing.
Fantastic. Kate, thank you so much for this very comprehensive analysis of Afghanistan.
It's been a real pleasure.
That was Kate Clark on the State of South Asia podcast. This episode was edited by Ritika Chauhan. We'll continue to keep our eye on Afghanistan, so don't forget to read Salman Rafi Sheikh's story on how the world must engage with the Taliban and much more on the politics, history, and culture of Afghanistan from our archives on our website, himalmag.com. You can also listen to our other podcast, the South Asia Review of Books, hosted by Shweta Srikantan, because South Asia deserves its own review of books. And don't forget to sign up for our newsletters to keep up with Himal's work. We'll be back soon with another in-depth conversation on the next episode of State of South Asia with me, Nayantara Narayanan. Thank you for listening and see you then.